All right, welcome everyone. My name is Annette Griffith, and I'm one of the ARP instructors in the online Applied Behavior Analysis program. And one of my coworkers, Jack Spear, he's also an ARP instructor. He and I worked together to put together this presentation to share with you about summarizing experimental articles. Unfortunately, Jack wasn't able to be here today, so I'll be the one going through and doing the presentation. But he, did a ton of work in putting the presentation together and collaborating with me to figure out what exactly we should discuss. So I wanted to make note of him here as well. Let's see, we're going to go. So just to start off, in the field of psychology, research is very important. It's important for us to do to use evidence-based interventions when we're working with our clients and as we're developing new interventions, to rely on the literature. And whenever we're doing a research project or an applied project, it's really important that we base what we're doing on the work that's been done before us, that we look to find out what do we know, what do we not know, and help and ensure that our work is able to kind of fill those gaps. And so where we go to look at that research would be our peer-reviewed journals. There's a lot of sources of information available to us online and in libraries. And there definitely are a lot of good, a lot of good resources available in books and websites and things like that. But we're going to focus our attention right now today on looking at peer-reviewed journals. And the reason that we're going to do that is because when we're getting information, when we get information from a book or from a website, it can be really good information, can be very reputable information, but it doesn't go through or typically doesn't go through a peer review process. So what makes peer-reviewed journal articles kind of special in that way is that not only have they been written by the authors of a research study, or a critical review or analysis of a paper, they've been written by those authors, but they've also been looked at by a group of those authors' peers. So people who are also knowledgeable in that area of research, they go through and they, every time we submit an article for publication, it goes out for peer review, and there's a group of individuals who are going to go through the research and make sure that it's grounded in all of our prior research, that the methods and procedures that were used are ones that are reputable and are acceptable for our area of study. So peer-reviewed journals are a really good source of information for us as we're looking to develop our thesis projects or our applied projects, because we know that the information that's provided to us has gone through kind of that level of scrutiny to make sure that it adds to the field that we're interested in looking at. So it's been rigorously edited for quality and contribution to the field. So across a variety of areas of psychology, typically where we're going to be finding those peer-reviewed journals is through our library. There are a variety of databases that are available to us. The specific articles or journals that are available in any particular database are going to vary, but typically we're going to be using PsycInfo, PsycArticles, PsycBooks. Sometimes I also use ERIC, which is an education database, but we can also find things that are very relevant for us there, depending on our populations that we're working with. But these are some of the databases where we're going to be able to find those peer-reviewed journals that we're going to be looking for. I know there are kind of some how-to videos available through the Chicago School Library that can help us, learn how to do good, thorough searches through those databases. There's a lot of little tricks that we can use to make sure that we're finding everything that we can that's relevant to our areas. So there's a lot of videos, and then also the library support staff have been really great in working with me and with some of my students in helping us to find articles and to especially find articles that may not be available in full text right away. But so this is where we're pretty much going to be finding what it is that we're interested in. And so what our attention for today is we're going to be talking specifically about peer-reviewed journals and how we're going to be summarizing those. So looking at experimental articles, I mentioned if you're going to be doing an applied research project or or an applied project of some type, we're going to want to base what we do on the literature, and we're going to want to know about what research has been done in the areas where we're working so that we can identify what gaps exist and we can set our work up to fill up those gaps. So when we're looking at experimental articles, there's a variety of different types of articles that we might look at. But when we're looking at experimental articles, it's important for us to kind of look to make sure, is the article truly experimental? And so the most important thing that we're looking for is an inclusion of an independent variable. So something that's going to be under the control of the experimenter and something that we're going to be systematically manipulating. And we're going to be looking for the inclusion of a dependent variable. So what is it that we're actually going to be measuring? In our field, is typically going to be something related to behavior, but it could be, a variety of different things that we're looking at. Something that's going to be measured that we're interested in changing. And the goal of an experimental study is to see if the changes that are made by the experimenter in the independent variable are going to result in changes in the dependent variable. And the goal is for us to find a cause and effect relationship. We want to look to see when we make specific changes, what happens. And so research articles or experimental articles, these are going to form the basis of our projects. And so it's important for us not only to be able to read them and understand them, but also for us to be able to summarize them, for us to be able to talk about what these articles are telling us and what we're able to find, or what we found when we looked at those articles, what the researchers are reporting on. So when we look at doing a summary, I'm sure you've all seen lots of different types of summaries. So you've seen some that are good and some that are not so good. But what's going to make a good summary is a brief report or a boiled down version of more complex ideas or papers. So basically we're thinking about what's the take-home message that's being provided in a research article. And I'm sure you've seen there's some research articles that are already very short, very brief, that present kind of the main ideas and the main things that were happening in the study. And there's some that are much more complex. Sometimes I'll pull up a research article to take a look at, and it'll be, 30 pages. And there's a lot of information in there. So obviously sometimes it's going to be a little bit easier to boil things down than other times, just due to the length of an article, how much is provided. But it's important for us to be able to identify a few key pieces of information so that regardless of how long a research study may be or how complex a research study may be, we I guess are able to identify the important parts, and we're able to report on those important parts. So that way we can still provide, regardless of the length of the research article we're reading, we're still able to provide a brief and clear explanation of the article and what happened in that particular study. So when we're looking to do our summary, there's a few key things that we're wanting to look at. The first thing, and I guess the first two things are very closely related. The first is we want to look at the research question. We want to look to see what specific question were the experimenters looking to answer. And very closely tied to this would be the hypothesis. And that would be what the authors expected to find from their experiment. Sometimes the research question, and sometimes we might see the authors actually specifically state one or the other. Usually we do see the research question. Often it's identified as the purpose of the study. But we have, when we're identifying the research question, the hypothesis, sometimes the authors will state both. Sometimes they'll state one or the other. Like I said, typically you will see the research question that's posed there. And through reading the introduction and the setup, we can kind of infer what the hypothesis might be. Sometimes we're not clear what the hypothesis is, and that's okay, but we want to make sure that we have at least one or the other. So, for example, if we imagine a study where the authors want to increase classroom participation for a group of students, the hypothesis could be something like the authors expected that rewarding classroom participation would increase the frequency of hand washing by students. They might say something like that. Or they might simply just state the research question that the authors are looking to examine the effects of a specific intervention on a particular behavior of the students. So as you go through, Typically, where you're going to find the research question posed is usually at the very end of the introduction. So the authors are using the introduction to set up all the previous research, to talk about what else has been done in the field. And as they get to all that, they start to identify, even though all this information is known and all of this has been done in this area, these are our gaps that we have. So often researchers are going to identify those gaps, and then they're going to pose their research question to address those gaps. And that's also where we might see the hypothesis as well. They'll pose the research question to address the gaps, and then they may also state a hypothesis. So that's one of the first things that we want to look at. The second is we want to look at the variables. So what actually were the variables of interest for a particular study? We typically start with the independent variable, so looking to see what exactly was the researcher trying to manipulate to see what the effects would be. And then we also look at the dependent variable to find out exactly what was being measured. Whenever we're talking about those, it's important that we may identify specifically what the independent and dependent variables were, but we want to make sure that we're phrasing our summary in a way that it's clear which was the independent variable and which was the dependent variable. And we'll go through an example in just a little bit where I'm going to kind of show you how that may look. The summary should also contain a brief explanation of the procedure. Procedures in experimental studies are often long and detailed. So for example, the procedure would cover, our entire method section where we're talking about our participants and, what the manipulation of that independent variable looked like, how we're measuring the dependent variable. There's often a lot of detail that's included in there, and a lot of it is often very interesting and very relevant for the work that we're doing. But when we're doing a summary, we want to make sure that we're providing just a brief description. We want to know sort of what was done, but we don't want to go into such long detail that it's taking away from our purpose and our ability to talk about what we're going to be doing. We want to provide kind of the highlights. So for example, when I was talking about hand washing, a summary of a procedure might be something along the lines of the authors rewarded each instance of hand washing by delivering praise to a student. So it's not going into all the specific detail. I don't know about, what was the frequency of reinforcement? Was there a specific reinforcement schedule in place? I don't know what that reinforcement looked like. Or if we talked about, if it's praise, I don't know exactly what that praise may have looked like. So there's all these details that if someone's interested in, they would have to go back to the study to find. But I've given a brief summary of exactly what that procedure was so that we have a general idea as we're moving forward and talking about the literature. The summary of results needs to focus on a major issue. So we need to talk about the results. We need to talk about, did the independent variable produce a change in the dependent variable? So in that example where I was talking about hand washing, if I'm looking at, my question might be, did rewarding hand washing produce an increase in that behavior? So if the answer is yes, that would be one part of the result summary. So I would say that it increased. The other part of the statement would be how big that increase was. So I might have my statement where I say that hand washing increased by perhaps 40%. So I'm saying that not only did it increase, but how much did it increase? So we want to know about what is the effect, and then also what is the size of that effect. So once we talk about the results, then we have questions about the implications. So why do implications matter? And where are we going to find those? Those are going to be part of the discussion. And so if we're looking at implications and we're looking at importance, why is it important to have students washing their hands at school? It helps reduce spread of germs. It helps students perhaps have less sick days, which, maybe there's some research that shows that fewer number of sick days relate to better academic test scores. We can relate that to long-term outcomes. There's lots of different things that we could tie through our line of research. But we want to know about, these are the effects, what are the implications, and then what are the areas for future research. And again, but we have to remember, we want this to be really brief. We don't want it to be really long. We want it to be, usually I tell my students that we want it to be 1 to 2 sentences kind of maximum. We want to be able to condense that into a small, a small amount of information. And so we're going to talk about that in just a few moments, kind of when I go through our example in more detail. But thinking about, the results, where are we going to find those? Obviously, we have a results section in our research studies that we can go to, but usually there's a lot of information that's provided there. And so we want to be able to condense that down. We want to be able to find out what are the key things that we're looking at. So typically what we want to do is we want to identify what were the dependent variables that we were interested in looking at, and what was the effect for those dependent variables. So we want to specifically say, if I have 3 variables that I'm looking at, I want to very briefly say, for variable A, what happened, for variable B, what happened, for variable C, what happened, and then also talk briefly about the size. You want to make sure that we're really, really condensing it down. And so we'll talk about that in just a moment as well. And the discussion, where we're going to find that would be, obviously the discussion section is a great spot for that. The abstract is also a really good spot as well. Usually the author has already done a little bit of work for us in the abstract by condensing down their results and talking about, usually there's a sentence or 2 sentences about implications or about future research. So the abstract is also a really good spot to look. But typically I find, if you want to have just a really brief 1-sentence description of implications or of future research, usually we're going to find that in the very first part of the discussion or in the very last part of the discussion. There may be some interesting things sprinkled throughout, but if we're trying to pull out some of those key pieces, usually that's where we're going to find it, is either kind of closer to the beginning or closer to the end. So like I was mentioning, all the information that I've kind of talked about so far. So the research question, the hypothesis, usually are going to be related to each other. We may have one or both of those presented. The variables, the procedure, the results, the discussion. We can read through all the different areas of a research study. And definitely if you're going to be citing a study in a thesis project, your dissertation, or applied research project, definitely you want to be reading through those articles, because it's important for you to understand the literature in your area. It's going to help you to develop your study. And it's definitely important to make sure that you're correctly citing things, you're not incorrectly citing things like that. However, if you're looking to identify quickly, is this article something that will be useful for me for my dissertation and my thesis, and you're going through a lot of articles and you're trying to do it quickly, the abstract is a really good spot. And then later, once you've read through your article, decided it's a good fit, and you want to start discussing it in your introduction or in your papers, you're setting up your study. The abstract is a really useful place to go to be able to identify those key pieces of information. So you don't want to use that kind of in lieu of actually reading the article. Definitely want to make sure you're reading the article. But the abstract is a really good place to be able to go to identify those key pieces of information that are important for us as we are going through and describing our study in a very brief and very concise way. So here is just a quick example. So I wanted to leave you with, thinking about, okay, we have these key pieces that we need to identify. And ideally, we could kind of work together as a group to kind of go through an article and identify. But for our purposes right now, what I wanted to share with you is this is an abstract from a paper that looked at, it's from the field of applied behavior analysis. And so we're looking at the comparison of discrete trial instruction. So that's where we break down our teaching for our students into very small, discrete steps. It's comparing that versus MAND training. And manding is requesting. It's just a term that we use for talking about requesting, really. And so we're looking at the effects of discrete trial instruction and MAND training on the acquisition of independent requests for children with autism. So I wanted to present this abstract to you, and just to kind of highlight some of the the key important points and kind of show you what a summary may look like, but also to show you how we can pull a lot of that from the abstract. So like I said, if I were doing a study in this area and I wanted to use this to support my research, I definitely would be reading the full article. But later, as I'm going to describe it briefly, the abstract is a really good spot to go to pull out those key pieces. So I'm just going to start off. So as I said, the present study is comparing the effects of discrete trial instruction and MAN training on the acquisition of independent requests in 6 children with autism. So there was 2 multi-probe designs across participants. So it's a particular small n design type. And they were conducted with 3 participants who were receiving either MAND training followed by DTI, or they were receiving DTI followed by MAN training. And so they were looking at the acquisition of independent requests, but they also looked at eye contact and challenging behaviors. Results of the study indicated that 5 of 6 participants made more independent requests and are required requesting faster in the MAN training condition. They had slightly better eye contact in the discrete trial condition, and there was fewer challenging behaviors in the MAN training condition. And overall, the results indicated that MAN training was a more effective method for teaching children with autism to make requests. So that's what we have here in our abstract. So if we go through and think about, I'm just going to go back here really quick. We're going to go through and look at talking about our research question and our hypothesis, our variables, our procedure, the results, and then a discussion point. And so if we're thinking of all of those points that we want to make sure we have in our summary, we can go through and we can look at, okay, first thinking about what's our research question. And I'll just kind of share with you that this research article actually does not specifically state their hypothesis. If I read through the introduction for the study, I kind of get the impression that I can kind of allude to the fact that they are thinking that MAN training is going to be more effective. However, it's a gap in the literature. It's an area that we don't really know a whole lot about. So they don't specifically state what their hypothesis is, but they do state their research question. And I've highlighted that here in yellow for you. So as they're looking at their research question, we can identify it as they're looking at the effects of discrete trial instruction and MAN training on the acquisition of independent requests in 6 children with autism. So that's their specific research question. They're looking to compare the effects of intervention 1 versus intervention 2 on independent requests for children with autism. So that's something that we would want to highlight, take note of, so that we can include it in our brief summary. The next thing we want to look at is our variables. And remember, we are going to have 2 types of variables that we're interested in looking at. We're going to be wanting to look at our independent variables and our dependent variables. So if I look back to this abstract again, I can see that there's a lot of information about variables kind of sprinkled throughout the presentation. And so the first part that I'm going to talk about here really quickly, I'm going to look at those independent variables. And so let's see here. And so I have a couple different colors that I kind of use to highlight a few different things. So in yellow, what I have is kind of basically the independent variables, sort of the overall independent variables, what they're looking at. So they're looking at discrete trial instruction, and they're looking at MAN training. But if I read on a little bit further, I can see that it's actually a little bit more complex than that. It's not simply just discrete trial training versus MAN training. They're actually looking at MAN training followed by discrete trial instruction, and then they're comparing it to discrete trial instruction followed by MAN training. So all of the students or all of the children who are participants are actually getting both types of intervention. It's just which order they're getting it in. So I highlight this in yellow because really, if we're looking at our independent variables, we're looking at discrete trial instruction and MAN training. But I also highlighted this in orange just to kind of highlight what we're really looking at. So our independent variables are discrete trial instruction and MAN training, but specifically they're looking at the order of which is done first. And then if we look at our dependent variables, and this was supposed to be green, it's not showing up very well, it's green, but we have a couple of different dependent variables. So if you remember, the dependent variable is something that we're looking to see if it changes or not with the implementation or manipulation of the independent variable. And we can see here with our dependent variables, we're looking at The primary one is our acquisition of independent requests. So how students are acquiring their independent requesting skills. And then we also have some ones of eye contact and challenging behavior. So for our independent variables, we're looking at the MAN training and the DTI, and specifically the ordering. And with our dependent variables, we're looking at acquisition, eye contact, and challenging behavior. And then we're also interested in the procedures. And in this abstract, there's a very brief description of the procedures. Obviously, if we go to the methods section, we're going to get a lot more detail, but kind of the key thing that we're looking for here is the multiple probe design across participants. Having that multiple probe design, it's telling us what the design is, and that can tell us a lot about, how the interventions are being implemented. We can see, knowing about a multiple probe design, I know that we collected our baseline data first, and then we started to implement the intervention. And then we have our results, and they have a lot more information about results here than any of those other areas. But specifically what they're telling us is that 5 of 6 participants made independent requests and acquired requesting faster in the MAN training condition. They had slightly better eye contact in the DTI condition and fewer challenging behaviors in the MAN training condition. And that overall, the results indicate that the MAN training is a more efficient method for teaching children with autism to make requests. So in our brief summaries, usually we want to condense things down just a little bit, but this is kind of the gist of the results that we're going to be interested in. Again, the results section is going to have a lot more information, but in our very brief summary, we're going to be wanting to pull out those highlights. So for that purpose, this information is probably good for being able to give a brief description, but again, you're going to want to actually go and read that results section because there's probably a lot of other detail that's been provided that you're going to want to know about for your research, but you don't necessarily are going to have to report on as you're providing a brief description. So this may be sort of what, if I'm looking simply at the abstract to pull my information, this may be what a brief summary may look like. These are the authors here in the year. So I might say Jeanette Harris and Del Molino used a multiple probe design across participants to compare the effects of discrete trial instruction and MAN training on the acquisition of independent requests for children with autism. Results indicated that for the majority of the participants, MAN training resulted in faster acquisition, a higher level of independence, and fewer challenging behaviors. And then I would also go on to say the authors indicated that, and I would spell this out. So when we talk about discussion or implications, those were not provided. Those were not provided in our abstract. So I would need to actually go to the article to find out, what are the implications of this. So it may be something along the lines of, the authors indicated that MAN training may be more effective or maybe a preferred choice for practitioners that are looking to increase a child's ability to make requests. And future research is needed to, to confirm this or to ensure that there's no other issues that we would need to address. We would fill that in with, again, very brief 1 to 2 sentence maximum of what we actually think kind of the implications of this study are, or what our directions for future research may be. But you can see here that I talk about the procedures. So I talk about that multiple probe design. I talk about, I have my research question here. So they're comparing the effects of the discrete trial instruction and MAN training on the acquisition of the independent requests for children with autism. So I have the population here. I have, like I said, my independent variables. I have my dependent variable, my primary one mentioned here. But then when I talk about my results, I also have the information about the MAN training, the acquisition, the independence, and the challenging behaviors. I could probably expand on this a little bit. If I wanted to talk about, remember we talked about the effect plus the size, I could add in a little bit of information here, but this would be a really nice brief summary that includes all of those relevant pieces of information. And when I'm working with my students, so as an ARP instructor, I help students to develop their research projects, their thesis projects. And when we do that, a lot of writing the introduction is talking about that previous research. And so a lot of what I do is helping students to summarize their research articles. And this is sort of a very, I guess, kind of an example of what we use as I'm working with students. And obviously, we want to add some variety. We don't want students using the exact same, format for every single paragraph, because that would get really redundant. So we do add in a little bit of variety and, reorganize some things a little bit. But this is the format and the template that I use to kind of guide students with, usually right off the bat. Usually what we do is we help students say, okay, let's put everything into this type of a format, where we say the authors, they used, what type of design, to do what, and we talk about our research question. So to compare the effects or to examine the effects, we'll say exactly kind of what that research question is. We make sure the population is mentioned here. Sometimes we'll add an extra sentence here. So I might say, I may have said, here the authors used multiple probe designs across participants to compare the effects of discrete trial instruction and man training on the acquisition of independent requests for children with autism. Specifically, they examined the order of discrete trial instruction and man training to determine if the order has an effect. I might add that sentence in, just to add a little bit of that extra detail. And then I would go into the results indicated for the majority of participants, and then we go on to state what those are. I may, again, if I want to talk about the effect, I may add in one extra sentence here to say, again, specifically, to add detail. I'd add something in there just to kind of talk about the size of that effect. And then again, I go into 1 to 2 sentences to talk about the implications of those findings and the direction for future research. So really, I would say I have a maximum, let me just keep a quick count here. So I have 1, 2, I have 2 sentences here and 1 that would have to be carried on that we did not have information from the abstract for. So here I would end up with kind of a 3 sentences minimum. I would go with 6 sentences maximum is really what we can do when we're providing a really brief discussion. So like I said, this is the format, the template that I use as I'm having students create their summaries or their brief, their brief summaries of their articles. And then we go through and, like I said, you don't want to just plug summary after summary that's all formatted exactly the same into your introduction, because that will get really redundant. So we want to be able to kind of reformat things. But what I have students do is do this first. So go through and create these exact summary, use this exact format, summarize every article we need to summarize. Then once we have that all plugged in, then we can look to reword things. Then we can look to increase that variety, to help increase the interest in our introduction, make it read a little nicer, flow a little bit nicer. But at least if we use this format, then we know for sure that we have all those key pieces. We have our procedures, we have our variables, we have our research question, we have our results, we have our discussion points, our implications, and directions for future research. Once we have all of those down, then we can look to reorganize. But this format gives us a really nice template to be able to do that. So I think that is all I had. I think that was the last of my my presentation there. So that's all I had to share for today. But before I let everybody go, does anyone have any questions or want to discuss anything?
Dr. Griffith?
Yes.
Okay. I actually have a question. First, thank you for this. This was very helpful. What are the differences in summarizing articles for those of us who are outside of ABA, say outside of clinical, where some of our articles, I'm actually organizational leadership, so which falls under business psychology, where some of our articles are falling, of course, outside of PsycInfo. They may be coming from ABI Inform, and some of them are more theoretical or conceptual in nature. Have you all done a webinar for those type of articles by chance?
You know what? We have not, but I think just, I guess, to answer quickly, and I'm sorry, I'm going to start coughing now. I think that probably could warrant its very own webinar, because there's a lot of different things to kind of have in mind as we're doing those types of summaries. So I'm going to actually add that as my note right now, that we'll kind of talk about that. But as you're doing that, just thinking about theoretical articles, that's not something that my students work with a whole lot. So it's not something that I kind of do very often. But we do sometimes have those types of articles that need to be discussed. And usually we try to look for, oftentimes I find, and not always, but often, the authors are already kind of dividing those or organizing those articles into kind of key sections or key areas where they're discussing specific topics. And so for those, I usually like to start off very similarly. So let me, if I can just scroll through here to the very end. So when I have my summary here, usually I start off very similar. So I'll actually have, like the authors, and I'll say, instead of talking about the design that they used, I'll say, Jeanette Harris and Dalmanio discussed the importance of topic A, or presented an argument for theory A, or whatever the case may be. I kind of still start off with, what is the point of that article? So we start off with that. And then from there, then instead of talking about my specific procedures and my results, I'll often go into, I'll say these authors discussed this particular topic. They identified four key 4 key points we need to be aware of, or we need to be thinking about, something along those lines, and lay out what those are. And then again, I try to keep it really brief. Can you do, one sentence to kind of summarize what's the take-home message for that section or that topic? And then again, wrap it up at the very end with one final sentence that kind of is, what's the take-home message from the article? And I know sometimes that's not always as easy. Sometimes, especially some of the more theoretical papers sometimes there's a lot of stuff in there. But usually if we can identify, what's the purpose? Why did they write this article in the first place? Usually we can pull that sometimes from the title. Sometimes the titles don't help us a lot. But if we can pull out, what's the purpose of that article, start with that, add, one sentence per key point or key focus area throughout the body, and then have our final wrap-up sentence at the end. I find that can also be a similar kind of format that we can use across articles, that can kind of help us with that. But yeah, I think having its own webinar just on that topic, I think would be helpful, because they're not always that easy.
Okay.
Does that help though a little bit?
No, it does. Because a lot of times ABI Inform, some of them are experimental, but they're conceptual, they're theoretical, and sometimes they're more, I don't even know how I want to describe those articles.
Yeah,
they're a little bit.
Yeah, so I think if we can just think about it the same thing, like how do we keep this to the minimum number of sentences? So it's just a paragraph, and then identifying, that key, what's the main purpose? What's the take home point? And then how do we fill in that middle part with what are the main ideas? I think one of the hardest things I know I had initially when I was a student, when I was first kind of learning to summarize research articles, was being comfortable leaving out details, because everything seems like an important detail. And so you don't want to leave it out. But realizing that we can't cover everything in our summary, and we need to be able to, make it as brief as possible, and know that it's okay to not cover all those details. People can go back to the article for all the details. We just want to give it, what's the take home message?
Mm-hmm. And we have a really good DWE here in DC, so outside of what you've said, which she has mentioned as well, was that, things in the article that are important are things that specifically relate to your dissertation topic.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Either for it or against it, or in line with it or not in line with it. Either way, as long as it's what relates to what you're to what you're working on.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks for your question. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? All right, well, thank you so much for attending. I really appreciate it. I apologize for some of our technical difficulties that we had getting started, but I'm glad you were all able to make it. We have recorded the session, so we will get that posted up as well if you weren't able to catch all of it in the beginning.